Now you might think that this picture just behind me is one of the oddest things you'll see in this landscape. A 1,000-year-old nearly church plonked in the middle of a henge, an earthwork that's around about 4,500 years old. Quite a bizarre picture, but let me show you something just across the road. Now don't get me wrong, as a picture that is unique, I'm pretty sure, but there's something else extremely curious. Okay, we'll come back to the church henge curiosity very shortly, but if I can just find a gap in the hedge here across the road, we can see a tree line, a hedge line, which is still there today, and that marks the edge of a huge henge, so much bigger than this one. We might be able to see a better view from above. In fact, back beyond the church we have another 2 henges, we have barrows, we have an abandoned medieval village. In fact, an aerial survey undertaken in 2000 established that within 1.5 kilometre radius of this complex there were 178 ring ditches, that being the only thing left of a barrow, unsurpassed anywhere in Wessex. Okay, so what exactly was going on in this landscape here, and why do we rarely talk about it? Okay, so we have this really curious looking church stuck in a henge that is probably over 3,500 years older than it. That's curious in itself. We also have the southern henge with very little remaining above ground. This is almost comparable to something like the Durrington walls near Stonehenge. However, we have very little evidence for domestic activity here. So not only do we have this curiosity right here of the church and the henge, but if I spin the camera around, well, at the end of the tree line here in this field, we've got another significant barrow, almost D-shaped. If I swing just a further this way, same field, we've got churchyard henge as well. No relation to the church itself, just the proximity. And finally, behind the church, if I spin the camera around again, behind the camera, you can see another barrow in the distance there, and that has got 2 concentric circles around it. Could well have started its life perhaps as a henge in itself as well. So what exactly was going on with all these henges in the landscape? And of course the other question is why the church plonked right here as well. Often places like Avebury, significant henges like we see here to a degree, well, they started out as a house, a settlement, which was then memorialised. The heritage of that place was memorialised. But nothing here was found. Now, archaeologists have been working on this site over the period of many years, and they found no evidence of domestic activity here, no pre-settlement prior to this henge. So that lack of activity here in terms of a living presence, well, what did that tell us? To answer that, we need to head south, and we are following to a degree the banks of the River Allen just here. Within a mile or so we get to a small hamlet called Horton Inn, and there on that same side, that eastern bank, well, they found a cluster of barrows. And if we continue along this river we come to another settlement, that of High Lee, and we find there once again, and perhaps more importantly for this topic today, a cluster of barrows. And you may be thinking, of course, what has all this got to do with Knowlton Church and the henge back there? High Lee specifically was subject to some archaeological excavations. What intrigued them was the triple linear alignment of over 30 barrows. They noted that only 2 remained, the rest had been reduced to what are now ring ditches. They decided to excavate both. So the first of these 2 was a little underwhelming, for want of a better word. We have the earthwork remains, and we have one bottom of an urn inside it with the remains of a cremation. That was it. The second one though, they had another chance, and could this perhaps provide us with some archaeology, something to give us a really tangible insight into what was going on in this landscape? Well, it certainly didn't disappoint. Lots of things were found here which could almost deserve a video in their own right, but what we're after is how could this help us with the Knowlton complex and our understanding of this whole landscape. In the centre of the barrow was a wooden frame inside a rectangular pit. No base, no lid, so think of a bookcase on its side without shelves led down, and 2 cremations were inside. They're dated this to 1948 to 1747 BC. That's all good, very Bronze Age, but what came next? Archaeologists had not seen before. You see, prior to these cremations, an elaborate enclosure was built consisting of a number of concentric rings of stakes. These were surrounded by regular pits, also forming an even wider circle beyond. Now, this combination of pre-barrow features, this combination of these irregular pits and these stakes, well, that was unique. Now, those stakes was clearly marked out this mortuary space. It was later then obviously important with context to the barrow itself, which came later. So was this actually a rare thing, or perhaps it's just that we haven't found any like that to date? Another pit was opened, and they found that this wasn't the only pre-barrow activity here. We have more stake holes, but this time the stake holes were part of a structure, perhaps oval in its shape, with supportive stake holes towards the centre, providing support for this superstructure. The pits contained significant quantities of domestic waste, all indicating domestic usage, a lived space. Some of what was found within the pits was burnt timbers and ash, and of course this would give us a date. In fact, not only would it give us a date, but it would also begin to help us piece together this puzzle of what was going on here and at Knowlton. That date was 2411 to 2270 BC, which not only predated the barrow for sure, but it was also contemporary with the henges back at Knowlton. So now we have a link, at least in date form, and as the archaeology continues, well, we start to see evidence of a settlement. We start to see larger staked, more rectilinear type buildings, and we start to see people having settled there. Now, all of these features appeared along this eastern bank of the River Allen. Perhaps in some ways they were linked to it, unifying that space. So the henge usage here could be funerary and may have turned into ceremonial and monumental landscape, perhaps for the dead. The significance of the water should not be overlooked. We have this well documented in many areas. Now, over on the west side of the River Allen, the banks of it, well, we see earlier activity. We see the Neolithic and we see their monuments, the Long Barrows and the Cursis monument. Of course, the Dorset Great Cursis, 6.5 miles long. We see the landscape littered with those monuments, long barrows and such, but here on the east side we now see new and emerging social and religious ideas at the time of the introduction of the Beaker people and the Bronze Age. That's not to say we don't see some of that on the west side, but here on the east we seem to have far more structure. So the Bronze Age came to an end around 800 BC, give or take, in this area, and then we move into the Iron Age and then on to the Roman era, and as Christianity slowly starts to settle in, well, 1100 AD, the Normans decided that they would put this church right here in the middle of this henge, this pagan henge. And whilst their philosophy was, we're not going to deface or remove these old pagan sites in a really sort of obvious way, but we are going to stamp our authority of Christianity here. Certainly at Knowlton, they did a better job of that than perhaps any. Now, this church would serve the abandoned village, I think just down in the valley there. You can still see remnants of it today. Now, that would suffer greatly from the Black Death. Whilst it would continue to be re-renovated on a couple of occasions, well, I think in the 1700s the roof finally fell in and it was in the abandoned state thereafter, and as we see it, continue in that state still today. Knowlton Church not only stands as this relic of the faith that was here, but also a quiet testament to the continuity here. This really obscure medieval church sat in the bounds of this Neolithic, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age setting, this henge here. Our lives themselves aren't disconnected from that ancient past. In fact, I feel like on hot days like this, where you feel much more of a connection to these people that would have lived here, worked here, built the henges, built the barrows, and then of course built more modern churches. I think everything is this long continuation, and I guess being out here in the landscape, you do really feel part of that connection. I've been Paul. If you've enjoyed this, click on subscribe and I'll see you this time next week.